Part 1. The Arrest and the Dilemma. The night was thick with tension as the flashing blue and red lights of police cars illuminated the dark alley. The night was thick with tension as the flashing blue and red lights of police cars illuminated the dark alley. Two figures, known only as Jack and Vince, were cornered. After months of evading the law, their luck had finally run out. The cops moved in swiftly, cuffing them before they could react. The two men exchanged a brief knowing glance, a silent promise to stick to their story. But deep down, both knew the stakes were higher than ever. At the station, Jack and Vince were separated into two cold, sterile interrogation rooms. The walls seemed to close in as they each sat alone, the weight of their choices pressing down on them. A detective entered each room, placing a single sheet of paper on the table. It outlined their options. A. If one confesses and the other doesn't, the one who confesses walks free while the other gets the maximum sentence of 30 years. B. If both confess, they each get 4 years. C. If both refuse to confess, they each get 10 years. Jack stared at the paper, his mind racing. He and Vince had been partners for years, but trust was a fragile thing in their line of work. Vince had always been the more impulsive one, quick to act and slow to think. Jack, on the other hand, prided himself on his ability to stay calm under pressure. But this was different. This was life or death, or at least freedom or decades behind bars. In the other room, Vince was sweating. He tapped his fingers nervously on the table, his eyes darting between the paper and the one-way mirror. He didn't trust Jack as far as he could throw him. What if Jack had already cut a deal? What if he was sitting there, ready to throw Vince under the bus? The thought gnawed at him, eating away at his resolve. The detectives left the rooms, giving the two men time to think. The clock ticked loudly, each second stretching into an eternity. Jack leaned back in his chair, trying to weigh his options. If he stayed silent, and Vince did too, they'd both get 10 years. Not ideal, but manageable. But if Vince confessed and Jack didn't, he'd be facing 30 years, a lifetime. On the other hand, if he confessed and Vince didn't, he'd walk free. But could he live with himself, knowing he'd betrayed his partner? Vince, meanwhile, was spiraling. His mind kept circling back to the worst-case scenario, Jack confessing, leaving him to rot in prison for 30 years. The thought was unbearable. He couldn't take that risk. He had to protect himself. But if he confessed and Jack did too, they'd both get 4 years. It wasn't freedom, but it was better than 30. And if Jack stayed silent, Vince would walk. The temptation was too strong to ignore. The detectives returned, their faces unreadable. "Time's up," one of them said. "What's it gonna be?" Jack and Vince, in their separate rooms, made their decisions. The tension in the air was palpable as the detectives collected their answers. The fate of both men now hung in the balance, their choices irrevocably intertwined. Watch out for Part 2.